Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to this session on policy solutions for a better world. Um, my name is Shoilan Nandi, and I'm a reader in social policy at Cardiff University, and I will be chairing today's session. My co-chair today is Professor David Gordon, the director of the Bristol Poverty Institute at the University of Bristol. Before I introduce our speakers, there are a few words of housekeeping which I have to deliver. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the BPI YouTube platform and embedded in the BPI's Institute website. So by attending, you are consenting to being part of this recording, and so thank you for that. Please ensure that you have added your name on Zoom rather than being listed as guest, as the BPI team will be monitoring attendees, and we also need to know who will be asking questions for each of the speakers. You will be able to ask questions via Zoom's Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. But due to time constraints, we may not be able to answer every question, but please feel free to get in touch with the speakers after the session to continue the conversation or to link up with them at one of the virtual networking sessions. Please note that the chat function is not available to attendees, so please use the Q&A function. Please be respectful. At all events at this conference are being monitored, and the BPI reserves the right to remove attendees whose comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. With that done, I have the great pleasure to open the session for three very interesting talks from three distinguished speakers. Our first speaker today is Mr. Yewaleshet Mekkonen from the African Child Policy Forum based in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Yewaleshet is director of the African Child Observatory Program at the ACPF, a Pan-African Center for Policy Research and Advocacy on Children. He has worked for more than 25 years in policy research, program management, and development of research tools and methodologies, including the development of the Child Friendliness Index of African governments, a quantitative framework for measuring government performance in realizing the rights of children and promoting their well-being. The index is being used as an advocacy tool to promote state accountability and greater commitment to children in Africa and beyond. He will be talking today about adjusting the focal length of poverty reduction policies and strategies in Africa towards longer-term interventions to address core issues. So I'd invite Yewaleshet to the stage.
Thank you so much, Shailen. I think that was too generous, I would say. Let me share my presentation. Okay, and it was a very generous introduction. Thank you so much, Shailen. But I want to begin by thanking Bristol Poverty Institute, not only for giving us this opportunity to share our experience, but also for exemplary partnership we have on a number of projects. So a big thank you to Professor David Gordon and the entire team in the Institute. As you have seen, my title is a bit mouthful, isn't it? But it critically questions the firefighting nature of our effort in terms of combating poverty and suggests long-term interventions that address the core issues that contribute to the perpetuation of poverty. So there is, I think there are hard facts that we need to accept, that we need to internalize, and that we should take into account as we contemplate solutions. In the context of Africa, currently we have more than 430 million people living in extreme poverty. It's nearly 150 million than what we had 3 decades ago. The increment alone is more than twice the entire population of UK. You see, this is like a loan with high interest rates where you keep on paying for years, and if not decades, but you only find out that you have not even addressed the accumulated interest rate. That's how big is the problem of poverty in our context. Again, poverty is also a child face in Africa. as most of them who languish in this situation are children. And yes, urban poverty is decreasing, increasing in many settings of Africa. But what we find is that more than 80% of those living in extreme poverty are in rural areas. So poverty is increasingly becoming a rural phenomenon in our context. Of course, fragility is also the other factor that's also contributing to this problem. Now, when you look it from the percentage point of view, yes, there is a modest increase in the rate of poverty over the last 3 decades. But such kinds of central measures are appropriate only for regions and countries with stable population. But for high fertility region like Africa, such kind of measures conceal, I think, the bulging base population and gives a wrong signal that we are on the right direction. But looking at the magnitude of poverty that we have, it simply shows that the effort that we are putting in place is not commensurate with that of the magnitude that we have. And COVID-19 and other crises are further exacerbating the problem. So what it means is that I think the business as usual is not helping us much, and that there is a need to step up our efforts. Now, what is driving poverty in the context of Africa? What is it that underlying factor that we have not adequately looked at? I think in the coming slides, I will show you some of them. The persistent high fertility is one of the problems. This is happening in already impoverished communities in rural areas and in poor households. As a result of this high fertility rate, the age structure of most African countries is broad-based. And in less than, let's say, 30 years, we will be having nearly 1 billion children in the continent. You can imagine this huge number of increment will already overstretch the services that are already struggling to provide adequate services for children. But such unprecedented growth of child and youth population can be an opportunity, but also at the same time be a challenge. We can see 2 scenarios. We can consider this considerable increase of the child and youth population as an opportunity to reap the demographic dividend through investing on children, through coordinated social and economic interventions that contribute to the achievement of building human capital. Or we can go as business as usual and, if I put it bluntly, and face the consequences of increasing and further deepening poverty and the consequence of even further widening inequality. We have already seen signs in some countries where such unprecedented growth is posing threat to security, stability, and prosperity of countries. So basically the outcome depends on what we do now, what governments need to do now in terms of really addressing these challenges, in terms of maybe using them as an opportunity than a challenge. The other key factor is governance. If there is one critical problem that is hindering, the advancement of Africa in almost all its spheres of economic and social political endeavor, is bad governance. If I may borrow the word of late Kofi Annan, who said that good governance is perhaps the single most important factor in eradicating poverty and promoting development in Africa. He said this years ago, but it also applies now and perhaps in the future as well. What we learned from the most recent Mo Ibrahim's Index of African Governance is that, yes, there was an improvement in the performance of good governance over the last years, but it has started declining. But the decline is happening in very critical areas such as security, rule of law, participation of citizens, and inclusion. You see, when there is a declining performance in these very critical aspects, it will be very difficult to achieve the SDGs, and mainly also the child-focused SDGs as well in terms of addressing child poverty and poverty in general. The problem lies usually that the accountability mechanisms that we have tend to be toothless, and that they can't impose sanctions when there is even a broad daylight embezzlement of public funds, and where there is a huge violation of human rights, including children's rights. And a contraption and I think wastage of resources as a result of poor working method is also contributing to further deepening poverty in our region. Crises are the other factors that are really further contributing to the deepening of poverty, and mainly that of children. I think beyond COVID, whose impact that we have seen over the last several months, armed conflict is a key factor that we need to take into account as we talk or contemplate of solutions to address poverty in the context of Africa. In my view, armed conflict is a manifestation of failure of systems to address grievances in time. They are manifestations of failure in terms of preventing human rights violations, failure in terms of really addressing marginalization of groups. Of course, with the growing number of population, scarcity of resources is also becoming cause of clashes here and there, which later on grows into full-fledged armed conflict. The problem with armed conflict is that its impact can be felt after several years after the conflict has ended, because of the devastation that it causes on the livelihood of people, because of the devastation it causes on these services that take a long time to reconstruct and to rehabilitate. So it's a very critical aspect that we need to take into account. Now, as I said earlier, poverty is becoming increasingly a rural phenomena in Africa. But I think that is the costs that we are paying as a result of neglecting the rural majority. In almost all indicators that you see, there is a huge discrepancy between urban and rural areas. For example, if you look at access to electricity, it's 31 versus 78. But even hidden with the average numbers, you find some countries that have less than 1% of access in the rural communities. You see, it may not be a good or a big news that there is such a huge discrepancy between urban and rural areas, but the fact that it has remained so for decades, I think should be one. The nature of the rural population is that they rely heavily on, subsistence agriculture that may not even satisfy the minimum needs of the family. So the increasing population has also created land pressures, migration to urban areas. The situation of girls and women also tend to be very poor, and the high prevalence of child marriage and onset of early marriages, childbearing is also adding a fuel to this. So all these factors are really calling for urgent action, for a long-term commitment to address them and break the cycle of poverty that where most of those who are suffering under it are children. So what is it that should be done to address these core and underlying factors that are perpetuating poverty? I think there is a need to accelerate the fertility transition without the need to creating new demand for family planning services. By addressing the already high unmet need, I think much can be achieved in these respects. I also feel that the health facilities, particularly in the rural settings, needs to be strengthened. They need to be strengthened to provide services, maternal and child health services, and other adolescent reproductive health and related services. Yes, regionally, the African Union has initiated a campaign to eradicate poverty, but we haven't seen much of it, and there is a need to scale up effort to address child marriage, because addressing child marriage has many advantages in terms of contributing to combating poverty. Child-sensitive social protection schemes, that's the pilots have shown us that it is a very effective scheme to address poverty, but it's only happening in limited areas, and that we need to, expand it, particularly to the rural areas. Our own report, the African report on child well-being 2020, showed that every dollar invested in girls has many-fold returns in social and economic benefits. So investing in girls is very important. So there is also a temptation to go into short-term intervention, but these, I think, requires long-term interventions and dedication around that time. Enhancing governance. Maybe I don't need to say much on this one, but apart from saying that there is a need to build our capacity of our public institutions. They should be the facilitators of poverty eradication, not the bottlenecks in terms of addressing it. Now, as I said earlier, there is some work that needs to be done in terms of improving the rural communities' livelihood. Can we help them by providing them solar powered irrigation pumps so that they at least can produce twice a year? Can we help them boost their productivity? Can we help them sell their products at relatively best prices by providing them access to mobile phones? I think those kinds of interventions need to be done to enhance their livelihood and lift them out of poverty. But this needs to be also complemented with investment infrastructure, and as you know, power changer is energy is a power changer and freedom to access. My final slide is this. It's about value attachment. The principle of leaving no one behind really hinges on the value that we attach to each and every individual, irrespective of age, irrespective of gender, irrespective of race, irrespective of whether he's from Africa, from the West, or irrespective of race from Latin. But the problem comes when we introduce sentiments. Sentiments, yes, that every individuals are equal, but some are more equal than others. The problem comes when such sentiments find their way into our policies and practices, into our programs. Then we end up really leaving behind those whose value we have kind of undervalued. So apart from the government interventions, be it long or long terms particularly, it is also every one of us as individually and collectively have responsibility as a global citizen to help these poor people to come out of poverty and create a better world. Thank you very much. I think, Chairman, I might have managed my time. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Yovalishit. That was fascinating. I should have said at the start, and my apologies to one and all, that speakers are going to be having 15 minutes so that we can get them all in time, and so that all questions that we may have, please, we will try and address some of them because we won't have much time at the end. But I'm sure if you email specific questions to each of the presenters or to the members or other people in the group, that they would be more than happy to engage in a discussion going forward. Our second speaker today is Professor Olli Kangas from the University of Turku in Finland. Professor Kangas is the director of the Equal Society Research Program at the Academy of Finland and professor at the Development of Social Research at the University of Turku. Previously, he has been the director of governmental relations at the Social Insurance Institution of Finland and worked as the Olaf Palm Professor at the Department of Political Science at Uppsala University in Sweden. It says H.C. Andersen. I'm assuming that's Hans Christian Andersen, professor at the University of Southern Denmark, which is a lovely title for anyone to have as a professor, the Hans Christian Andersen title, which is fantastic, and a professor of social policy at the University of Turku. He'll be talking today about the possibilities and impossibilities of basic income in Finland. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. We move now from the warm south to the north and to the cold north. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's great pleasure and honor to be here. I'll tell something about the Finnish basic income experiment that was running 2017 to 2018. And I will start by saying something about the very experiment, and then I would say something about the well-being effects of the experiment, and then, because the main target of the experiment, the idea that was given by the government was to study employment effects of basic income, then I end up my presentation by saying something about that aspect that was the most important aspect for the government. The final setting that deviated from that setting that the research group led by me proposed, so that the amount that was paid out was 560 euros net a month, and it was totally unconditional, so that it was paid regardless if the unemployed person found employment or not. And we had the 2,000 unemployed persons taken randomly from the registers of social insurance institution of Finland to be included in the experiment, and the participation was obligatory, so that immediately when they were chosen or taken randomly from the pool of the unemployed, they got a mail or a letter from social insurance institution that you have been included in this experiment and it's obligatory for you. And then the rest of unemployed, they formed the control group, so that in the very beginning of the experiment we had a treatment group and then a totally identical control group. And as I said, the experiment lasted 2 years. And of course, there are always pros and cons in this kind of experiments. The problem with the experiment, the Finnish experiment, is that it lasted only 2 years and there were only unemployed persons included, and it was so-called partial basic income that replaced only some basic security systems in the country. And it was nationwide randomized experiment, meaning that we can't study community effects, meaning that if we take one community and give basic income to everybody, in that case, there will be things that take place and things that happen. And those things are totally different if those people are randomly taken everywhere from the country. But the strong side of this experiment is that it's a randomized controlled experiment, so that we have identical treatment group and identical control group. And in the end, or if we in the end of the experiment find differences in those two groups, we can draw causal consequences and say that the differences are caused by the experiment. And also it was obligatory experiment, meaning that it was not possible to jump in and jump out as you wish, but everybody who was taken had to stay to the end of the experiment. And also the strength of the experiment is that in Finnish case, we have lots of registers that can be used and that can be linked to together, and also linked to those interviews and surveys that we have done, so that there are lots of possibilities to study ex post and before the experiment and during the experiment what people did, so that there are lots of possibilities to evaluate. And some words about the welfare effects or welfare consequences of the basic income experiment. So that those people who participated in our surveys, they reported better financial situation and also better social and health well-being. And the interesting thing is that there was a statistically significant difference between the self-purchased or how people thought about their financial situation and if they can cope on their current income. And in the treatment group, people were more satisfied with their income levels and said that we can cope better than those in the control group. And interestingly enough, if we controlled, or when we controlled the level of income, those people who had precisely the same level of actual income in the treatment group, they said that they can cope better. And the conclusion from this is that it's not only the level of benefit, but it's also how the benefit is paid. In the treatment group, they knew that, okay, in the beginning of every month, I will get that 560 euros. Whereas those in the control group, they had to go to the social office, they had to go employment office and explain why they should get the benefit, so that those who were included in the treatment group, they knew, okay, the money will be on my account as agreed upon. And then also there were much stronger trust, not only in other people, but in the social security system and all kind of social institutions among the treatment group than among the control group. And here in this picture, that is a little bit similar as a transistor radio inside, but it's pretty easy to interpret this picture in that sense that if you take treatment here, getting basic income decreases financial problems, and then it increases overall trust that has been here used as an overall indication of well-being. There will be some other end results, but we have used the trust in social institutions, trust in other people, trust in police, trust in social security, etc., etc. And also education, it decreases, as we know, financial problems, and it increases trust. And then education also has an indirect effect in that way that the education decreases financial problems, and financial problems decrease overall trust, so that education has positive indirect effect and also positive direct effect. And the interesting thing is that the treatment doesn't have direct effect to well-being, but it goes through other factors included in the evaluation. For example, treatment decreases bureaucracy, and if people have experiences of bureaucracy, they don't trust in social security, and they don't trust other social institutions. And also education is linked to health, so that those with better education, they have higher level of health, and health increases overall well-being. And then age decreases health, and then it has an indirect effect via health, but there's also indirect or direct effect from age to overall trust. So that the story here is that the linkages between level and the way how we pay out our social security, it doesn't necessarily have any direct impact or loop to well-being, but those loops go via other intervening factors, and therefore it's important to look at those intervening factors. And then when it comes to the employment effect, that was, as I said, in the core of the goal set by the government. And the experiment started in the beginning of 2017. And as you see here, there was no differences whatsoever in the beginning of the experiment. So that the black dots are the treated, those who were included in the basic income experiment, and the circles are controls. And during the first year, there were no differences whatsoever, but during the second year and towards the end of the first year, differences began to pop up. And if you look at the total sample in the treatment group and the total sample in the control group, we don't find any significant differences. So that there are differences, they're more employed in the treatment group, but not statistically significantly. But in some groups, the experiment had a significant effect, and those groups were those who had families, who had family children, and those who were immigrants. And the explanation that I have here is that those who had families, they were younger and they were healthier, and also immigrants are younger and healthier than the most of the native born elderly unemployed people who were participating in the experiment and who were included in the control group. And then basic income is not enough. And what I try here to explain is that basic income can help those people who have abilities to work to find employment. So that if I'm healthy, in that case, basic income may help me to find employment. But if my health condition is weak and I don't have so much work ability left, in that case, basic income is not enough to help. And the conclusion or lesson that I draw from this finding is that the decent level of income is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for finding employment. In addition to a decent level of income, we need, at least in the Finnish case, we need social services, we need employment services, we need education services, and all kind of training services, so that the combination of decent level of income and decent level or rather high bundle of different services is necessary and sufficient for finding employment. And I would say that it's not necessary that it had to be basic income. It's, for example, in the Finnish case, basic security is rather universal, and it means that the basic income wouldn't produce that much. It would bring some new elements, but not that much. And for example, when it comes to the pandemic situation that we have in Europe and everywhere just now, in very many other European countries, they have introduced lots of provisional extra benefits and extra systems, whereas in the Finnish case, we have not done it because the social security system is rather comprehensive and it's rather universal. So that in the Finnish case, this pandemic has not caused any major changes in discussion of basic income, as it has done in very many other countries where they are demanding that we must introduce basic income in order to combat that kind of pandemic situations that we have just now. This was my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Olli. That's fascinating. I'm sure there's lots to be discussed after the final presentation. But thank you so much for keeping to time. Our final speaker for this particular session is Stuart Lansley. Stuart is a visiting fellow in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol and has written widely for academic journals, for weeklies and newspapers on the issues of poverty, wealth and inequality. He is co-author of A Basic Income for All, From Desirability to Feasibility, and also Breadline Britain, The Rise of Mass Poverty with Joanna Mack, who I understand is in the audience as well. He's also written The Cost of Inequality, and his latest book, The Richer, the Poorer, How Britain Enriched the Few and Failed the Poor, a 200-year history, will be published later this year by the Policy Press. He is a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum and an associate of the Compass think tank. And he'll be talking today about beverage and unfinished business. Is it time to implement a guaranteed non-means tested basic income floor? Stuart, the floor is yours.
Okay, yes, what I'm going to talk about is basic income, its feasibility in introducing such a scheme in Britain, but also looking back at whether introducing a basic income would in some ways be finishing the job started by Beveridge 75 years ago. The Britain, along with many other countries, has suffered a number of rolling shocks over the last 40 years. You know, we've had deindustrialization, we had the 2008 crisis, we had, you know, a decade of austerity, and now we have COVID. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that we do not have a social security system that is up to the task for dealing with those kind of shocks. Benefit levels are mean compared with other countries. The system is heavily dependent on means testing. We've moved a long way away from the sort of national insurance entitlement principle. The total level of spending on benefits being for people of working age has been cut by a quarter since 2010. The system is also highly punitive. And this graph shows the number of sanctions that have been issued by the Department of Work and Pensions. You can see that there were 5 million sanctions issued in between 2000 and 2018, which leaves basically benefit recipients with no income at all for 6 weeks, or in some cases longer. So is the solution, or part of the solution, to reforming our social security system to make it more generous and more secure, introducing some kind of basic income or national minimum? Now, the idea of a national minimum, that there should be a basic living standard that everybody enjoys, was first discussed in detail in the minority report of the Poor Law Commission in 1909, so that's over 100 years ago, written largely by Beatrice Webb. And Beveridge, in his 1942 report, always said that his proposals were about delivering a national minimum, and he was going to deliver this national minimum essentially through national insurance, through full employment, through family allowance, and through national assistance as a last resort. Well, as we know, that system has not worked to guarantee a minimum income for everybody. So the idea of a national minimum has continued to gain ground. People like James Mead, the Nobel Prize economist, who resuscitated the idea of a social dividend. The national minimum wage was in some way part of the idea of introducing a national income. And now, of course, we've had this a basic income debate that has been gathering pace over the last few years. Now, what are the strengths of the idea of having a non-means tested income floor? Well, but it would essentially introduce an income plimsoll line below which nobody would fall. It would actually switch the balance away from means testing to universalism, which is what Beveridge always intended. He always intended the means tested bit, the national assistance bit, to effectively be withdrawn within about a decade. It would be a significant weapon against insecurity. It would mean that families know that they've got this income coming in week after week. And in some, depending on the level, such a scheme could be empowering for individuals and families. It would be non-judgmental, and it would give them choices over work or when to work, whether to go back to training or whether to set up a small business, because they've got this security of income. the whole scheme could also be introduced incrementally. Now, of course, you know, the idea of a basic income is a Marmite issue. There are lots and lots of critics who don't like it, but I think it's beginning to sort of gather a wider level of support. There are, of course, alternative models. Some people favour a sort of big bang scheme that would replace the existing social security system. The simulations that I've done with a colleague, Howard Reed, shows that such a system would be extremely difficult to implement and be very expensive. So what we have been proposing in the work that we've been doing is that we should have a modest income floor, and we should see it as an income floor. Some people have accused us of thinking small. Well, not really. Such a modest scheme would still have significant beneficial effects. The rates that we are proposing is £40 for a child and £60 for a working age adult a week. That means that a couple with 2 children would essentially be guaranteed an income floor of 10,400 a year. Now, the impact of such a scheme, we've done these calculations on the basis of a micro simulation model of household spending and benefits and so on. And the impact of this scheme would be that child benefit would fall by 37%. There'd be a fall in working age poverty, there'd be a fall in inequality, and a fall in the level of means testing. These, of course, are the static effects of introducing basic income. And, you know, there would also be dynamic effects that would be positive as well. The gains of the scheme would be heavily concentrated amongst the poorest, you can see here, and the losers would be those in the top, largely in the top 2 deciles. In order to pay for the scheme, the net cost of such a scheme would be high, probably around between 5 and 10% of GDP. So in order to afford it, we'd have to make a number of tax adjustments. And the most important one of those is that the income tax personal allowance, which costs £120 billion a year, would be abolished and would be transformed into an income payment for everybody. We'd also have some adjustments to the income tax rate below the current standard rate, some adjustments to national insurance rates, and the net cost of such a scheme after these taxes, the changes in taxes, would be of the order of £15 billion. Now, to put that in context, the total cuts in social security spending since 2010 have been 40 billion. So this would not, you know, this would take us back to levels of spending which were still lower than in 2010. So just to summarize, there are a number of key elements going on in this basic income scheme. Firstly, as I said, there's the conversion of the personal tax allowance and an equal cash payment. There would, in effect, be an increase in child benefit, effectively a doubling in child benefit. The tax changes would mean that the basic income for higher income groups would be clawed back so that they would either be neutrally affected or slightly worse off. So the whole system would be highly progressive. Now, this is not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve every single problem. And there is a funding issue about how to fund it. And one possibility for funding it would be that it should be wealth funded. Now, wealth is the elephant in the room, if you like, of tax and social policy. This graph shows that the total level of national wealth in Britain is 13.7 trillion. That's nearly 7 times the size of GDP. Yet the level of public wealth is only 1.7 trillion. So most of it, you know, 90% of it is privately owned wealth. Yet this privately owned wealth is hardly taxed. It's taxed at an average rate of between 2 and 3%, whereas incomes are taxed at over 30%. So there is a huge potential for implementing such a scheme by what we've called the construction of a citizens' wealth fund. If we were to transfer a small proportion of this wealth level, this national wealth level, into such a fund, then we've calculated that after 10 years, you'd have a fund worth $500 billion. After 20 years, it would be 0.75 trillion. And after 30 years, it would be around 1 trillion. And this could be used to pay a basic income as a citizen's dividend. We don't see basic income as a quick fix. You know, we see it as a part of a long-term plan for building a fairer, more equal, more secure society, more resilient community over time. And the main beneficiaries would be younger generations and next generations. So we see it really as a long-term plan. If you're interested in the sources for the data I presented here, they're here in this final slide. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I didn't even get to use my 2 minutes plus. You do have some more time if you want to.
No, that's fine. I think.
Well, that's fabulous because it gives us a good 13 minutes left for chatting before we get kicked out automatically by the system, I suppose. Would speakers like to turn their videos back on again? And I would invite questions from the floor if there are any. Please use the Q&A function and we will respond to those questions as they come up. I noticed several important names as professors in social policy amongst the attendees, so it would be good to have some contributions from them. Co-chair Professor Gordon, would you like to start off with questions? I have a couple.
You should ask the first question.
Sorry?
I think you should ask the first question.
Fine, in that case, I do have one. Thank you to all three speakers. Those were really interesting talks. I do know that I recommend to my students reading material from the ACPF, getting them interested in social policy and comparative social policy around the world. But I will certainly be pointing them to the sort of the Finnish example and also to Stuart's most recent book when it comes out. My question is to your Wallership, because it was, in some ways, it was depressing from what I learned as an undergraduate 20, 30 years ago about the challenges of development or underdevelopment in sub-Saharan Africa. They seem to be exactly the same as to what you're identifying in terms of the persistence of rural poverty, conflict, environmental change, environmental catastrophe in some places. And you raise the issue about the toothless accountability mechanisms. And I'm often asked by students, but what can be done? We have these UN conventions to which governments sign up, but what happens if they don't do anything about it? And so could you say a bit more about the putting teeth into those accountability mechanisms? What would you propose?
Very interesting question, Shailen. As I was saying, I think the accountability system is, the independence of ensuring the independence of such body is where we have a problem. So there is partiality with parties, partiality with governing bodies that deprive them of their independence. So basically you lose your teeth when you are somehow associated with it. That's the problem. So I think very good example that we have is the Human Rights Commission in Nigeria. They made effort to ensure its independence, but the government was trying to use the fund provided to the commission to, somehow ensure some kind of compliance with their. But later on, the parliament decided that the fund be given from the Federal Reserve, that they should not be begging government bodies bodies to get their monthly, or annual budgets. So that was a practical demonstration of what ensuring dependence means, you see. So they don't have to, so they were doing their job. But is that the case in many other countries? The answer simply is no. So that gives you tools, that gives you, the other is also the capacity issue, to be honest. We had the chance to assess the capacity of especially ministries and departments responsible for children affairs. You might find one expert or one director and so on, but they've been mandated to the protectors or the providers or the implementers of millions of children. So when you are not capacitated, basically you'll not be able to do the job that you were supposed to do. So in that way, you'll not be able to achieve results. So those are really the mechanics that are really contributing to all these challenges. But the good news is that yes, there is an improvement being made in almost all sectors, but it could not outpace the challenges that we have. And there is a need to do more to really enhance this and address these problems. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. We have had one question come through, and I'll put it to both Stuart and, well, to Stuart, I guess. One of the questions from Jim Robertson, it's given the levels of inequality and attitudes in the UK, is the principle of the common good a realistic objective?
Okay. Well, that's that's a big question. I think that the evidence is we've created a hyper-individualized society, haven't we, over the last 40 years, away from the idea of the common good, which embraced within the whole Beveridge and post-war welfare scheme. We've kind of moved away from that. But just because, the common good might, to some extent, the erosion of the common good is a product of the economics and the ideological position with which we build our society. And if we have a position that is highly based upon individuals, highly based upon the financialization and marketization of, the parts of the welfare state, parts of the public provision, and a reduction in the concept of the public realm, then I think the common good erodes along with it. I think the part of the problem is that we haven't really had governments and leading politicians that have been arguing for an alternative to the highly marketized and individual societies that we've created. So it would be a big task, but I don't believe it's impossible. And I think the other issue is that I think levels of inequality at today's levels are unsustainable. They're unsustainable socially, morally, and they're unsustainable economically. The evidence is now absolutely clear that countries with the kind of levels of inequality of today are highly unstable and highly turbulent. And we will continue to have those problems if we do not tackle the problem. And to tackle the problem, we do need, to some extent, to resuscitate the idea of the common good. So yes, not easy, but not impossible.
If I could ask Olli, what was the public response in Finland to this idea of a universal basic income or a basic income? And then we'll come to the next question from Glenn Brown.
It depends from whom you are asking it. So that if you ask from the proponents of the basic income, the Greens and the Left-Wing League, they say that it's okay. But if you ask from the Social Democrats, Conservatives, and True Finns, in that case, they are saying that it's invention of the Father Satan. So that it's very much dependent on which political camp the answers are coming from.
Yes, that is inevitably the case, for sure. Dave, did you have a question before we go to Glenn's question?
Yes, I'd like to ask both Olli and Stuart. there are always people, as you say, who treat universal basic income and these kinds of experiments as Marmite, in that they believe that poverty is a result of the poor not trying hard enough, and it's wrong to give money to the poor because it ruins their morals. And so whatever the results, there's always going to be an attack from some sections of the media and some politicians saying that the experiment has failed. And the Finnish experiment was reported in the British media as having failed. Even when money is given, say, during COVID pandemic, there was a campaign to give food vouchers or money for food so children could eat over the holidays. Some Tory MPs claimed the money would be spent on crack cocaine and prostitution. So how do you deal with the attack that will inevitably happen to any suggestion of a universal basic income or minimum income?
When it comes to the Finnish basic income experiment and the reports, I think that it's wrong to say that it failed. It depends very much what you are expecting from the experiment. But if you are expecting that it's a silver bullet, in that case, you are most probably to be very disappointed. That for the proponents of the basic income, the experiment was good in that sense that it showed that those people who were getting basic income, they were more enterprising than those who were not getting it, who were included in the present system. So that the basic income was not making people more lazy than the present system. And also what I tried to say, the overall well-being among those who were getting basic income was higher than in the treatment group. And they had more sense of dignity. Okay, the system deals with as a human being and I'm worth of something. So that there are that kind of things. But of course, the opponent said that the effect, employment effect was not big enough, that there should be a stronger effect. So that I think that it was a very good experiment and it didn't fail at all.
Do you want me to just say something brief? I mean, I think if you look at the history of progressive social change over the last 100 years, some of our most progressive institutions, the National Health Service, child benefit, the national minimum wage, were highly controversial when they were introduced, and they took decades of campaigning. Nobody would, look how difficult it is for governments who are opposed to the NHS to get rid of it. I mean, they tinker with it. And the same with child benefit and the same with the national minimum wage. I mean, there was fantastic opposition to the national minimum wage when it was introduced in 2000. But, even the present government keeps putting the rates up. So I think the debate around basic income is a little bit like the debate in the mid-1930s over the National Health Service, the debate in the 80s and 90s over a national minimum wage, and the debate in the 50s and 60s about family allowance and child benefit. So yes, there will be opposition, but we need public support. I mean, I think the difference with basic income now compared with, say, 5 or 6, 7 years ago is there actually is a social movement in Britain calling for a basic income. I mean, there are over 30 basic income hubs across Britain now, and groups of people have come together to press for a basic income campaign. There are endless debates, endless discussions, endless papers about how it could work, etc. So it's creeping onto the agenda. So let's see what happens. But I think once one country goes, then others will. And I think that what we are talking about is something actually quite modest in terms of the level of help, but it would also be pretty transformative, and it could be the first step. so I think if we're going to make it happen, I think we've got to get away from this debate about a sort of big bang scheme that's enough for that pays everybody 20,000 a year and it's going to cost 2/3 of GDP. But if we talk about a Plimsoll line, which is basically what Beveridge wanted at a low level, then I think that's got more legs.
Thank you, Stuart. Clearly, there's an entire conference that could be had on the issue of universal basic income. And it's surely not fair to only have 1 hour for the 3 excellent presentations that we have. I feel the hot breath of Sarah and Mel waiting to hit the exit button on the Zoom screens. So before we all get kicked out unceremoniously, I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I'd like to thank the participants. Yes, looking forward to continuing these discussions.